Hello, today we're going to be taking a look at my Nintendo Entertainment System. It's my front loader. I've had this in my collection for a long time. It's quite yellowed, looking quite sorry for itself, so didn't like the look of it in my collection, so I could have retro brighted it and brought it back to life, but they've had some fantastic upgrades now available for this NES. This is what we're going to turn it into. This is the finished product. We've got a clear case mod. We've got the NESRGB mod. We've got a new edge connector. Going to give it a thorough clean up. We're also going to put a nice new companion board on the back, which is helps out for the power distribution and outputs RGB. So it's really going to crisp up that image. So really bring it into the this day and age. So it's time to fix it and get on with it. First thing we've got to do is get it stripped down. Nothing particularly difficult on this. It's just Phillips screws, no protection bits. Nintendo hadn't gone that far now, so just undo all the Phillips screws on the base and we flip it over and the top comes off. Then some RF shielding and some other bits and bobs inside. So while I'm doing that, I'm just going to say I got the NESRGB from Old School Consoles. It's 79 British pounds plus delivery, which I thought was for the production values of the board and the what's on that board. I didn't think that was particularly unreasonable. I was quite happy with that. So first things, get the board out, then we're going to take off the edge connector and remove the cartridge slot. Just giving it a quick check over, but the edge connector was replaced a number of years ago, so I don't think that's going to be an issue because it hasn't really been used that much. Because it was an RF unit, like I say, the picture quality was crap, so I didn't really use this much, so hence the reason for doing this upgrade. First things first, I'm going to have a quick look around the board, make sure everything's okay, make sure I've got no leaking caps or any damage or any corrosion on the board. This large chip is known as the PPU, the picture processing unit. This is where the NESRGB interfaces with the main board. We're going to be changing a few of these capacitors down. We need to make some room for the NESRGB, so we've got to lay those capacitors down. We're going to take off the RF and power board, which just involves some desoldering. The PPU is quite tricky, but you know, if you take your time, it shouldn't be any problem. First thing I'm going to be doing is adding a bit of extra solder to the pins. This, when you're using a solder sucker, sometimes it just gives it, the solder sucker, something extra to grab hold of and suck it all in at one go. So, and it helps distribute the heat. So just using a solder sucker just to remove the solder from the pins, hopefully clear those pins out nice and damage free to help aid it. This is the little trick that really for large chips you should be using. Hot air gun, just locally heating up the pins, just giving a little bit of an extra helping hand. There are going to be some little bits of solder in there that are a little bit stubborn, like in this corner, and the hot air gun just prevents any damage to that PPU. I'm just going to nip over those vias just to make sure I've got no solder, little bits of solder left in those vias. Just just let the pins on the socket go in a bit nicer. This is the NESRGB. This is what you get in the kit. So there's some sockets there. Main board. Very nicely designed, very nice and neat. In the other bag we've got some pins and some sockets and some. If you're going about it in a different way, a different installation, you'd be using these as your outputs. There's a 5-volt regulator there. That capacitor we will be using, but because we're using the companion board, we won't be using a lot of these components, so I'll just get rid of those and we'll just concentrate on what I actually need for this installation. This is actually the version 1.4 NESRGB, so it does come with some extra enhancements, but we'll talk about those later on. This is the voltage regulator board and the RF out board, so we need to get rid of that. So I decided to take this off in first, but I will have to remove the connecting rods that join all this together, but we'll cover that a bit later on. So once we've got that out of the way, we're just going to start and remove this capacitor. It needs to be upgraded, just from a timing perspective. So I've laid the capacitors down. The way that capacitor interacts with the resistors and in that network, it changes the timings of the way that the NES boots up, and the NESRGB boots up in a particular way, so it needed that capacitor change to allow the NES not to wake up too quickly, I think, just to enable it to boot properly. So we'll get the precision edge pin connector and socket put in there, just making sure everything's gone nice and flat. Because it's such a large chip, if you get this wrong, it's quite a nightmare. So really make sure you've got all this right, and everything's nicely sitting nice and comfortably, and everything's all okay. You've got no bent pins and everything. So just thoroughly check everything when you're actually doing this, because it's be a nightmare if you solder it down then find that something's wrong. Now just giving it a quick clean up after that, just to get rid of all the residue. Good housekeeping's always just keeps things nice and clean, especially when you're working on it. Flux can be really tacky and horrible. So I'm going to put the pins into this, just basically to aid the installation, just to make sure everything's in the right place and I'm happy there. So I'm just using this as a jig, and then I'm going to drop the NESRGB onto the top of those pins. I quite like this sort of technique, just so I can get a feel that how everything's going to go in. I don't want to solder things on and then realise I put things in the wrong place or I missed something. So I do tend to work like this, where I like everything assembled. We'll just get a few little pins tacked in just to hold everything in place, then make sure everything is, I'm happy with everything in the way everything's installed. Then we can solder that in. So you just have to be careful here, because the PPU goes over the top of this. So you don't want any particularly messy soldering or anything too big. It does want to be a nice fine amount of solder, because like I say, the PPU is going to solder over the top of these pins. That's what I say. I'm just going over these, just making sure everything's nicely flat. Got no sticking out bits or anything like that. Making sure that it's flat with the board. As you can see, there's a number of jumpers on the board, and depending on what console you've got, whether it's an NTSC or PAL, different jumpers have to be engaged. So all it requires is just to rub some solder over the jumper just to bridge the contacts, or leave it open depending on which particular console you've got, on whether it's PAL or NTSC, or whether you want like de-jitter, or if you want to use a switch to change the palette or the controller. So these are the things that obviously you need to set up depending on your console itself. So in my instance, I need to bridge pin 7 and pin 4 and pin 3, because I've got a PAL console and I want to use internal power. And jumper 6 closed because the front loader is a positive reset system. So with that all done, then we can move on to removing this little connection piece that I've left on the RF power board. The instructions say to remove it from here first, but I decided that I wanted to desolder it from the board, just so I could resolder it and make sure I've got good connections on both sides. So this is the companion board. So you've got composite and audio, you've got RGB, you've got your palette switch in there, you've got your voltage regulation, 5-volt regulation, everything. So I thought this was a really great board to take away a lot of the problems. All the power supplies all sorted out, and it's a nice, lovely, convenient board to drop in and get everything all looking nice and great. So I ordered that from America, and it came quite speedily, so I'm quite happy with that. So what I'm doing here is just the connection piece, which transfers audio and voltages, and the power switch connections go through this. So I'm just making sure everything's orientated nicely and soldering this. So we've got some nice, good, nice, firm, fresh solder on those power lines. So what I decided to do here was to drop in the power board and then drop the motherboard on top of it, so that basically all the spacing between the motherboard and that power board was perfect. It doesn't show that on the instructions. I just thought it seemed a much better way, just in case there was any variations, or rather than try and solder it blind, just drop the board in, solder it in place, then obviously I can take it back out again and I know it's in the perfect position. Like I say, just pop the board back out when it's done. So there's a little earth strap that needs to be earthed from the companion board to the main board. We'll pop the NESRGB in, just so to stop it rattling around. If you don't use the companion board, you're going to have to connect your RGB lines and your socket to these connections. The companion board does it slightly differently, so they request you to connect directly to these RGB outputs over here. But it is fully explained in the instructions, so that come with the companion board, so it's all nice and easy to follow. So get those RGB connections plumbed in there. That's all great. Just going to pre-tin a few connections on the NESRGB. Get that ready for these wires. So if I can get my head around this, I'm just wiring in the earth connection. We've then got the composite and audio lines going to the socket. This doesn't take particularly long, it's quite straightforward, everything's well marked. The quality of the wires, the construction of the board is such high quality that it's been really a breeze to do this. What we need to do now is extract the audio from the main board and deliver it to the NESRGB, so we're using pins there which then go to these two resistors, or you can go, the chip just above it is the main CPU. You can go to pins 1 and 2 to extract the audio from the legs of the chip. I decided to go on these two resistors, that go directly from those. I thought it made a nicer connection and didn't have to worry about bridging any pins on the main CPU. So that's your standard audio output from the NES. You can go a step further and get the enhanced audio. There are some games, Castlevania and stuff like that, that do have enhanced audio. So this is just a bit of a hack to allow the NESRGB to extract that extra quality sound. So you wire in the 1K resistor between pins 2 and 9, and then from pin 9 this 47K resistor goes onto this wire, which goes back to the NESRGB. Popping a bit of heat shrink on there, just don't want it wafting around and shorting anything out. I was going to go that way round, but I decided not to. I'm just turning this round and going over the edge of the board. It goes to this little veer just by jumper 5. I've gone in from the other side of the board, so that's it actually soldered in. With that done, it's time to dig out the new case. I purchased this clear case from 8-Bit Mods. And it took a long while to come. I think they had a lot of issues getting this right. I think there was a lot of imperfections on this. I think there still is a few, but not many, and I'm quite pleased with it. I think it took a good 6 months to come from pre-delivery, so I'm really pleased with the quality of the actual construction of the plastics. I've had nothing crack, nothing came scratched. Everything was really, really nicely done. There was a few extraction. You can see on the bottom of it, there's a couple of extraction marks where it's come out of the mould. But like you say, nothing's going to be perfect. So just offering up the main board into there just to get it all positioned. Got the cartridge mechanism back installed with the edge connector. The only thing really you need to worry about, on the back of the edge connector there are 2 extra long screws. They're the only 2 different screws on the whole NES body, so you just have to remember to make sure they're in the right hole, and hey presto, there it is, all done. Got myself a little sticker there to put on the front of the flap that mimicked what came with the original NES. So now it's all done, I'm really happy with the design of it. I'm not happy with that sticker, I'm going to change that. I'm probably just going to take it off really. It's nice, I love to see inside the consoles and see the guts of what's actually going on. So really pleased that it all came out really well. It was well worth it. It was difficult because this NES actually wasn't working. There was a problem with the NES chip clock crystal. the 4 megahertz clock, it wasn't turning on. Even I made the horrible mistake of not checking that this actually worked before I started work on it. So biggest piece of advice is make sure the thing actually works before you start. But it's not a complex system, so I was really pleased. It was nice to actually get to know the NES a bit better, you know, from a technical perspective. So how does it play? Is it worth it? Well, here we go. Get it all powered up on my setup. I did buy a clear controller mod, and I have taken the decal off that other controller and put it on top, so I now have a clear mod. I think the video speaks for itself, how clear and crisp and how good the image quality and the colour reproduction is on this. It's absolutely fantastic. It looks stunning on my plasma. I'm really pleased with it. I think it was well worth it. It's taken me a long, you know, it's quite a while to install, get all the bits together, troubleshoot why the console wasn't actually powering on at all. I had no red light at all, and I found nothing online for that. So it was quite a learning curve, like I said, getting used to the NES. But it was well worth it, and I'm really happy. So if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.